So this is the story of Nellie Nolan. She is my paternal grandmother. And one of the two people that you see there, she was the mother of two orphan train riders. One of those was my father. So Nellie is my paternal grandmother. Nothing was known of her until I began doing this research. What I am going to be going over is kind of the Reader's Digest version of a 100-page biography I wrote about her early life. My father and my uncle did not know anything of their parents, and my father didn't learn his mother's name until he was 58 years old, and that was the only thing he ever learned about her. From childhood, I had been curious.
Gary, we're not seeing pictures. Are there pictures with us? We're seeing the text of your...
Well, I'll get to that.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we were seeing what we were supposed to.
What you're seeing is what I've got.
Great, okay. Great.
We have no pictures
of
my grandmother.
Okay.
So what I will be going over is the history as I know it from documents. So I've been curious about who my grandparents were, but my father was not very open about that. It was very clear I was never to ask. So as at the bottom there, it says you have no photos of her. So this is going to be strictly a document discussion. Some of the questions we had about who was this woman who was my grandmother. Some of the indications was she worked as a domestic. So did she perhaps get pregnant by her employer or employer's son and have to give up her children to continue her employment? Was she perhaps a teenage street prostitute in the tenements of Brooklyn? Was she neglected and abandoned? Did she die not long after giving birth to my father? Or all other kinds of questions. And one other kind of interesting note we'll get into, who was the man named Warren Anger, who is my uncle's father. So we'll start with this first document. This is my grandmother's April 1894 arrest record for vagrancy and commitment to St. Malachi's Home for Children. The formal charges of her vagrancy reads, lives without employment, wanders about, and does not give a good account of herself. So she was not quite 4 years old at the time. Her older sister, Katie, who we'll learn more about intermingling their lives, she was about 6 years older. She had also been arrested for vagrancy and sent to St. Malachi's about 2 months before Nellie. So you're kind of wondering, well, what do you mean about wanders around without employment? Well, the best representation of what her life would have been like in that era comes from a book, actually a photo essay published by a photographer of the era named Jacob Reese in a book titled How the Other Half Lives. This is one of the photos. It's been colorized, showing the typical child laborers of the era. One of the things that bounces out to me is you look into the eyes of these young girls and their stern looks. It's oftentimes referred to as a 1,000-yard stare. We often now refer to as PTSD. So that was my grandmother's early existence. And one of the other photos in Jacob Reese's book is this photo. And whenever I see this, I think of, could that be Katie, the older girl, holding my grandmother in her arms? Once again, you see that 1,000-yard stare. It's replete in virtually all the photos of Jacob Reese's book. So what was St. Malachi's Home for Children? This is the building. It was located on the beach in Rockaway Park, Long Island. They housed several hundred children, boys and girls. And when I look at this photo, go zoom in here just a little bit. Down here in the lower right corner, you see a lineup of girls, and I look at that and I wonder, could one of those be my grandmother? Of course, we'll never know. So the next record for my grandmother's life is her second arrest for vagrancy. At this time, she was about 10 years of age in July of 1903. This is the front side of her record card for her time being sentenced to what was known as the New York Catholic Protectory. It was essentially like a early version of juvenile hall. So we see her father's name and mother's name, William and Ellen, and that they live an intemperate lifestyle, which is a polite way of saying they're alcoholics. On the back of this card, it tells why she had been sent to the New York Catholic Protectory, where it reads, "This girl says her mother beat her and made her go after beer, and when she refused to go for any more, she was put out into the street." Well, then apparently her mother followed her and had her arrested once again by the Brooklyn Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, whereupon she was sentenced to the New York Catholic Protectory. And we also see here that it says she was at St. Malachi's home for about 6 years. She lived at the New York Catholic Protectory for about 4 years. I think probably those time frames in her life were probably the two most happiest time frames in her childhood. I think the most important piece of information on this card, the back of the card, is the final entry of 1907, May 21st, where she's sent to live with her sister, Mrs. Catherine Anger. Well, that happens to be Katie Nolan at 59 Bergen Street. So recall those dates and the address as we move into the next. This is a photo, or actually a picture, of the New York Catholic Protectory. It was located in the Bronx, 2 large buildings, one for boys, one for girls. They house probably about somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 kids overall. I think the building in the foreground is probably the girls' building. But it wasn't all just living in cells and whatever as juvenile halls are today. They had training classes for the boys and girls. Here we see a photo from one of the annual reports that the protector is required to submit to the New York State Legislature and Governor's Office. And I look at this photo, and again, I think, could one of these young girls be my grandmother? So now, how did Katie Nolan become Katie Anger? So here we see her marriage certificate to her. His name is Warren D. Anger. Says he is from Buffalo, New York. In actuality, he was born and raised across the Niagara River in Ridgeway, Ontario, Canada. And in fact, he was not single. It says he was single on the certificate, but in fact, he was not. He had been married in 1899, had 1 child with his wife. There's no indication that he formally divorced her, but he then wound up having a 2nd child with another woman in 1905. And in late 1905, he left Buffalo, New York area, went to New York City and married my grandmother's sister on January 27th, 1906 at Brooklyn Borough Hall. So now we see how the things come together here. This is the birth certificate from my uncle Walter, my dad's older brother. He was born in April 1908. And if we do a simple back calculation of the conception date, he was conceived sometime around July 21st, 1907, which is about 2 months after Nellie was sent to live with her sister. My uncle was born at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. That still exists today. And looky here, we see that Walter's father was Warren Anger, her sister Katie's husband, or Nellie's brother-in-law. We see the address matches up, 59 Bergen Street. And Nellie's age is 14 years and Warren's is 27 years. Another interesting thing to note is that this is during this time frame, this is the 3rd time in which Nellie would be taken into the custody of the Brooklyn Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And this is their facility, which is located at 105 Schermerhorn Street in Brooklyn. It was the early form of what we now call Child Protective Services. They were not really set up for long-term care and housing of the children they took in. Their primary mission was to remove children from neglectful and abusive living situations. So my uncle was born while my grandmother was in the custody of the SPCC, as commonly referred to. But after my uncle was born, the SPCC worked with another organization called New York Foundling Hospital, which is a large orphanage in Manhattan, to transfer the custody of both my grandmother and my uncle into their facility. This document we see is one of the memos associated with their my grandmother's transfer from the SPCC to the New York Foundling, thanking them for taking in my grandmother and my uncle. One of the things that I oftentimes think about is the second sentence, second paragraph, which reads, "You also find enclosed 2 small pieces of jewelry belonging to her." And I wonder sometimes, what were those 2 pieces of jewelry? And did she ever get them back? So this is the New York Foundling Hospital where my grandmother Nellie and my uncle were sent. It was established in the mid-1850s in Manhattan by the Sisters of Charity. The Sisters of Charity was founded by Elizabeth Ann Seton, who happens to be the first U.S.-born person to be canonized by the Catholic Church. So it's located on 68th Street. It actually used to span the entire block between 2nd Avenue and 3rd Avenue, a very large facility. They had about 2,500 orphans in-house and about another 2,500 that they had responsibility for, that they had arranged with foster care homes. On an average basis, they would see 8 new admissions every day, 365 days a year. So you can see that there was a significant problem of orphaned children in New York City at that time frame. So this is my father's admission record to the New York Foundling Hospital. After his birth, he was born September 29th, 1910. According to this, his birth certificate actually says September 30th. During that time frame, from my grandmother's original admission to the New York Foundling, she lived and worked there. She's noted on the 1910 census as working there as a servant with the specific responsibilities as a child's nurse. The New York Foundling Hospital actually had a program where they would encourage unwed mothers to stay with them at the New York Foundling facility in exchange for room and board if they would nurse their child and care for at least one other child. And my grandmother was one of those women, one of those mothers who did that up until April 1912. When my grandmother was pregnant, about 3 months pregnant with my father, Warren Anger, my uncle's known father, deserted my grandmother's sister Katie and returned to Buffalo. So he was kind of repeating his previous behavior. That may be because he was also the father of my father, but that's unknown because my father's birth certificate says father unknown. So after 1912, when Nellie left her work at the New York Foundling, she returned to live with her sister Katie again. By this time, Katie had remarried to a second husband by the name of Thomas Kelleher. And during this time frame, my grandmother worked at a shoe factory as a shoe finisher. And in November of 1915, she married her husband, a man by the name of Enrique Pai, at Church of the Redeemer. Church of the Redeemer was a Episcopalian or Anglican congregation. So it kind of begs the question, why did they choose to get married at a Episcopalian or Anglican congregation when they are both probably very associated with the Catholic Church? At least we know that from my grandmother. It may be the fact that my grandmother never revealed to Enrique that she had 2 previous children, and she didn't want that secret to potentially be revealed by the Catholic Church to Enrique. Or Enrique may decided he didn't want it to have the Catholic Church pressuring him to take on the responsibility of raising my father and my uncle. So we don't really know, but those are the 2 possibilities. Enrique himself was actually from Havana, Cuba. He was an immigrant. He came to New York City in September 1914. So in some ways, you could say that my grandmother and her husband were a real-life example of West Side Story. Other interesting factors here. At the time my grandmother married her husband, she lost her U.S. citizenship because at the time the U.S. federal law defined a married woman's citizenship as being that of her husband. So under U.S. law, they recognize Nellie as Cuban, not U.S.
1915.
So, and also, if we do some quick calculations from the birth of Nellie and Enrique's first son, she became pregnant within days of her marriage to Enrique. They would eventually have one other son. Henry was their firstborn, born in August 1916, and Woodrow, who was born in December 1918. His name Woodrow is likely because he was named after President Woodrow Wilson at the time, who was very well recognized and reputed around the world for having been the prime factor in bringing an end to the horrors of World War I. So that was my grandmother's life up until that time. And now I'm going to jump forward more towards the end of her life. Last June 2021, my wife and I traveled to New York to visit our daughter and attend our grandson's high school graduation. I had determined by that time that the last town where my grandmother lived was a place called Northport Village. It's located on the northwest shore of Long Island, but it's a cute little village, kind of a tourist town. And one of the days we were there, our daughter drove us up there. And fortunately, it was at a time when the pandemic was at a low point because of vaccines. So the Northport Village Historical Society was open. Was able to visit them and ask them if they could help me perhaps locate where the exact location, address where my grandmother lived. They put me in touch with the Northport Village Library. The reference librarian gave me her direct contact information. And when I returned home, I contacted her, and within a week or so, she got back to me and sent me copies of the Northport Village Directory, in which my grandmother is listed at living at 171 Main Street. And if we look to the center, that brick building in the center left, that's where my grandmother lived her last years of life. Here it is from a Google street level view. And one of the interesting things when we visited the town, we parked directly across the street from this building. And as we were feeding the parking meter, I looked across it and I go, that's a curious building. I had no idea why I was drawn to it. Now I do. While we were there, we also had the opportunity to visit her last resting place, Maple Grove Cemetery in Kew Gardens, Queens. It's near Jamaica Station, about maybe a half-hour walk from Jamaica Station on the Long Island Railroad. And we left a bouquet of 11 red roses, 11 being the significant number, one each for my father and his brother, one each for my sister and myself, one each for my uncle's one son, 4 for my 4 daughters, and 2 for my sister's 2 daughters. So some closing thoughts. It's fairly clear that Nellie's pregnancies with my father and uncle were probably the result of being sexually abused by war and anger. So it begs the question, what would Nellie have done if abortion had been an option during that time frame? Now, on a personal level, I support a woman's right to choose. So if Nellie had had the opportunity to exercise such a right, would she have done so? Given the origins of the pregnancies, I feel that she would have been perfectly justified. But then that leaves me with a bit of a personal paradox, because if she had exercised such a right, my father and uncle would never have existed, and I wouldn't be here today to be sharing this story with you. And none of my daughters, grandchildren, or my sister's daughters or her grandchildren would be here. So I'll close with this as how I came to know and develop a love for my grandmother. I know that she did the best she could.
Oh, wow.
Oh, thank you,
What
Gary.
a story. Oh my gosh.
Thank you, Gary. That was amazing.
I'll stop to share.
You have done so much research. We've been hearing about this story now for probably 2-3 years, and you've just done another whole level of research. And
yeah, I have traced her life all the way from birth to death. I didn't go over, I know the details of her lifetime, of her 2 subsequent sons, their children. I traced it down to actually living half cousins, one of whom lives in the area. Not had success in making contact with them though.
How did you trace them through DNA, or how did you trace these cousins?
I say from the obituary from her fourth son. He had 2 children, and in the obituary mentions their names. I was able to trace them down and pretty well confirm that they were the people I was looking for by location. Found yearbook entries for them in the Nashua County area on Long Island, where they were raised. And through True People search online, is able to trace it down to a woman who would have been my half first cousin. She at the time lived in Atherton. She has since passed away, but I have now also found the address and name for her one son who lives in the Morgan Hill area.
Gary, Roger and I need to go right now, but thank you so much for sharing our family story.
Good job, Gary.
Nice to see
Take
you.
care,
Lonnie.
sis.
And
Good to see you
Roger.
guys.
We'll talk soon.
All right.
Love you.
Love you too. Bye.
Gail
Gary.
asks,
Bye,
Gary.
Kathy. Say hi to Bob.
Yep.
Oh, I will, Lonnie. Thank you. Gary, that was just amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so, Karen, would you like to share your